If you want to grow happy and healthy cacti and succulents, one of the things that you're going to become very familiar with very quickly is the notion of a mineral-based soil. As far as I'm concerned, experimenting with different blends of soil is one of the more enjoyable aspects of the hobby. And so today, we're going to be going on a bit of a deep dive, looking at all sorts of different minerals, different rocks, different things that you might be considering adding to your mix. Some of them, in my experience, are fantastic, and some of them are absolutely shocking. But the joy here is in the experimentation. I'm not going to be giving you a recipe to use for your plants, because how I grow my plants could be very different to your growing conditions. But what I am going to do is share with you all sorts of different possibilities and let you have a bit of an experiment. And I'll be finishing this episode with an experiment as well. So let's not delay, let's have a real deep dive into the wonderful world of mineral soil components. Now there's one really important safety message before we get into all of these minerals. If you're working with dusty substances, especially things like perlite and the like, you want to protect your lungs. And so protective equipment like this is one option, or you can always moisten the soil mix and that'll keep the dust in and not going to end up in your lungs doing you untold damage. Something to keep in mind. Now I thought I'd start this off by looking at a few different options that are cheap, cheerful and available no matter where you are in the world, because you don't have to make something that is insanely complex. I enjoy the complexity, but you might not want to. And so we're going to start off by talking about sand. Sand is very frequently recommended as a mineral additive to soils to help it become more well draining. Because as we know, our arid growing plants, they don't want to stay waterlogged. But here's the problem with sand. They aren't all made equal. So let's have a look at good sand and bad sand and what it means for our plants. Sand comes in different grades, and what I mean by that is that the particle sizes are very different, and depending on the size of the particles in your sand, that's going to have a drastically different impact on the drainage properties of your soil. When you've got a very coarse sand like this one here, the larger particle soils enable there to be almost like pathways through your soil mix that enables water to run through in channels, and it adds an effective drainage method, prevents our soil from becoming too waterlogged, and it can be quite a valuable addition to any soil mix. The danger, however, is that many of the sands that are marketed as appropriate for cacti and succulents aren't really that coarse. In fact, they can be quite fine, like this stuff here. The problem with fine sand, even dusty sand, is that it has the opposite effect. Those very small particle sizes will actually hold on to, they'll retain moisture in our soil. They won't make it more freely draining, they'll turn it into a soggy, waterlogged mess. It's a really unfortunate property that comes with anything dusty, and it stands to reason why it's always worth sifting or sieving out any of the small particles in any of the minerals I'm going to talk about today. Because the smaller the particle size, the worse its drainage properties. I don't want to get too technical and too scientific. Just trust me on this one. So when you see a sand like this here, this is actually going to do damage to the quality of the drainage of your soil. I could leave this sand in a pot out in the blazing Sydney summer sun for days on end, possibly even weeks, and it still wouldn't dry because it clings so desperately to that moisture. And that's the complete antithesis of what succulents and cacti need. Don't believe me? Let me show you an example. Waterlogged soils by their nature can promote all sorts of issues with these plants, fungal infections, rot and death, but they also prevent oxygenation of the soil. And these plants like a nice gravelly mix because they like a bit of oxygen around their roots. So what I've got here are two pots of a species called Dudleya brittonii. It comes from Baja, California. Little Echeveria relatives. Beautiful things. In time they get this nice, really thick, white powdery coating over them. Makes them look quite stunning. Now, initially I planted up seeds in a mix that at the time I wasn't really aware but it was far too silty. It had a lot of that fine sediment, a lot of that fine sand. And the seedlings came up stunted. And you can see these things now have been growing for 2 full growing seasons. As a bit of an experiment, about 6 months ago, I got some of the stunted seedlings from one of the pots, repotted them into something that was far better draining, with far coarser, gravelly soils. And I think the results speak for themselves. They're not dying, but they're certainly not growing to full capacity. And that speaks to the fact that the soil really isn't enabling them to achieve at their best potential. So, what we want to do is get rid of any of those silty, dusty, tiny, fine particle sands from whatever we end up choosing to use. And now here's the real danger with sand. I bought 1 bag of coarse sand, sifted it out, and got both of these jars straight from the same packet. Fantastically usable stuff, and plant stunting, horrible silt. So, if you are going to use sand, even if it's labelled coarse sand or sharp sand or anything like that, it always stands to reason. Sift what you've got and get the horrible fine particulates out of it if you want to be left with something usable and fantastic for your plants. I'm not going to spend very long on this next component, but I do know that when some people are first starting off with the hobby, they hear mineral soils and they go and they find something that seems to match that description. I'm talking about these smooth, polished river pebbles. Now we need to just recognise that any mineral component by and large is doing one of 2 things. They're either assisting with the watering of our plants through drainage and porosity, or they're providing structure, something heavy and firm for plant roots to grip onto and hold them into the soil. These, well, I suppose they give a bit of drainage because they occupy a bit of space, but they're heavy and they don't give anything for plant roots to purchase onto. They're essentially an inert space filler. Largely pointless, somewhat decorative. Some people like to use them as a top dressing, and I suppose that's up to personal taste. But as a component in a soil, they don't really do anything. There are far better options, and I'm going to have a look at one of those now. Because there is a mineral substance that is readily available that is of far greater value to our mineral mixes, and it's this stuff, perlite. Now, personally, I don't particularly like it, and I don't really use it in my mixes, but it has some properties that do make it quite a valuable thing if we're not going to go and source some rarer, more expensive components. Perlite is essentially a volcanic mineral, although a lot of the stuff that you can get from shops these days is man-made. And what it is an incredibly light, almost like volcanic glass that is riddled with tiny, tiny microscopic pores, little holes all throughout it. What that means is it's incredibly light and it's quite water retentive. And you might be thinking, water retentive, that sounds bad, that sounds like that fine sand, but it's actually the opposite, because minerals like this that are porous with those tiny holes, not only can they hang on to water, but at the same time, simultaneously, they hang on to a lot of oxygen. And plants, they like to be able to access water. They just don't want to be completely silted in by it. If they've got water and oxygen simultaneously, then that's a really fantastic thing for them. Now, what that means, this stuff is kind of like a sponge in a way. And that's a valuable thing. And I'm going to keep coming back to that analogy because some of the other minerals that I'm going to talk about throughout this video a little bit later on are quite similar. The reason why I don't like perlite is because structurally it's not of much value. It's really, really light. Have a look at this. And so what you'll find is that in your soil mixes, it can actually float to the surface and then it just starts blowing around all over the place in a greenhouse, can make a real mess. But if you're stuck and you can't get any of the other really good minerals, this stuff here is of great value because plants love it, and it's a very traditional addition to potting mixes to help plants with their drainage and their access to oxygen and moisture. So, perlite, if you're in a pinch, real good one to go for. Now, if you enjoy AridZine, there are a couple of ways that you can support the show. The easiest thing you can do is hit like and hit subscribe. Super, super simple. There's merch available. I hand draw all of these things. I like to create t-shirts that I actually want to wear. So that's another option. And if you're really, really into it and you can't get enough, join the Patreon. I put out bonus videos every single week, and very, very soon I'll have the second issue of the physical zine. Anyway, you can find out how to do all of those things on the link on the screen. Let's get back and look at how to mix up some cool mineral mixes, hey? Now let's say you're at the point now where you're ready to graduate past those beginner level, everyday, easy to source minerals, and you want to start tinkering with your own really complex, convoluted mix. I'm going to share with you now 3 categories of components that you might want to consider. The first of those is structural minerals that do provide a bit of structure, something for plant roots to latch onto, to hang on to, and essentially anchor them into their pots. These minerals do have drainage values, but their primary purpose isn't necessarily about that. The second of the categories is minerals that assist with the watering. That is, of course, well draining, but also porous in that way that perlite is, like little sponges that hang on to oxygen and water and make both available to plant roots. And then the third category, let's call them situational. Things that might be of value for certain particular plants or certain particular growing situations, but they shouldn't probably go into every single mix as a standard. Things that change the acidity of our soil, for example, or other things that are really, really over the top moisture retentive soils that, you know, ordinarily you wouldn't necessarily use them for cacti and succulents, but they do have value elsewhere. So let's pull on our mad scientist hats, have a look at some crazy ingredients, and hopefully you're going to walk away from this very, very confident to start putting your plants into a soil mix that not only suits the plants themselves, but your whole growing context. Now, if we're talking about structural components, we're talking about those mineral components that the plant roots want to grip onto, and you can see it in this peyote button here with all of those feeder roots. Basically, the way that these plants work, they take up moisture and nutrients, is through tiny, almost hair-like feeder roots, and they need to grip onto things to be able to do that. And so you can see through this, these roots here, gripping on to a whole mix of different minerals that I've used in the soil. For a plant like this one, which is very low growing, that structural anchor isn't nearly as important. But when you're starting to grow very tall columnar cacti or similar succulents in pots, having heavy structural elements in your pots is a valuable thing to stop them from toppling over. So I got 2 minerals that I can share with you that are going to assist with that. A champion in this space is decomposed granite, which is a fantastic, very, very heavy mineral. You can just feel it in the pot, I can tell you what. Now, decomposed granite, at least how I source it, comes in bags that are very, very, very dusty. And so I need to kind of sift away maybe half of the mass of what I purchase. But you're left over with this wonderfully heavy substance, which not only does it provide great structure, it provides fantastic drainage and very, very slightly on the acidic side. So if you've got plants that do enjoy acidic soils, and that's really most of what we grow with a few notable exceptions which I'll touch on later, this stuff, you can't go wrong. Now, for me, I also find that it's a fantastic top dressing. It makes your plants look very, very smart. In fact, you'll find that a lot of the plants that I've got staged, ready to show, have been top dressed with a mix that is largely based around decomposed granite. Not only does it look good, but it keeps the soil nicely in place because of its weight, and it disperses water all throughout the pot. A really, really valuable thing, especially when you want to ensure that your prized plants are getting adequate moisture over a very, very warm summer. Now, the other mineral additive that I want to talk about here that does fantastic work as a structural component is a relative of sand, I suppose. I'm talking about sandstone. Chunks of sandstone. Fantastic stuff. Now, this stuff is probably a little bit more obscure. you're not necessarily going to be able to source it quite as easily the world over. Here in Sydney, all of Sydney is built on a plateau of sandstone, so the stuff is everywhere and therefore very, very easily available. Sandstone, like decomposed granite, is very, very heavy and very, very roughly textured, which gives those plant roots something to really gain purchase on. So fantastic element, but as you can see, depending on the size that you're using, they can take up a bit of space in a pot, which might otherwise go to things that provide nutrients or moisture. So I would suggest use them sparingly, unless you've got plants that really, really enjoy arid conditions. Now the next category of minerals that I want to look at are those that provide access to moisture, our fantastic porous sponge-like rocks. And you'll find that at least two of these are volcanic in origin. It's that volcanic history of the mineral itself that creates those tiny air pockets, those tiny porous holes that does such wonders for these plants. Now, I'm going to start with what I would rate as by far the most useful and valuable mineral that we could use in any soil mix whatsoever. I'm talking about this stuff, pumice. Pumice, volcanic rock, very, very porous, very, very light. It's like perlite in that regard, but not quite as insanely light. I don't think I could blow it to the wind. But pumice is the sort of thing that dreams are made of for these plants. Because it is riddled with tiny holes, it has that same sponge effect, oxygen available to roots, water available to the roots. It's a bit heavier, so it's a bit more structurally sound. And really, if there is only one mineral that you're going to add to any of your soils, this is the stuff to use, because it is just perfect. This stuff, this goes straight to the top shelf. Now the crazy thing is, you can actually just plant your plants straight into pumice, and if you give them a bit of liquid fertilizer with regularity, they'll grow completely happy. An essentially hydroponic setup. This Stenoserius here spent all of the last year growing in pure pumice. I only just repotted it the other day because I thought, hey, you know what? I'm a little bit over providing it with those nutrients. But look at it. It's happy, it's growing, and it suffered no ill effects whatsoever from a 100% pumice mineral soil. Fantastic, brilliant stuff. So if you come from a place that demands really particular watering, think about pumice as the base, if not the entirety of your mix. Fascinating, hey? Now the little cousin of pumice is this stuff, Scoria. It's a little bit more dense, a little bit more brick-like, and as a result, less riddled with those pores that make oxygen and water equally available to our plants. It's certainly not a terrible additive to a mix, and it will replace pumice or perlite in a pinch. Certainly it's heavier than perlite and therefore far more sound structurally. But if you can get your hands on pumice, there's probably no reason to go for this other than the fact that Scoria is significantly cheaper, at least in my area anyway. It's no slouch, it's a great additive, but it doesn't quite reach the brilliant levels of pumice. Still a great thing though, and certainly nothing to sneeze at. And then the last of these hydration experts is something that I don't actually have any familiarity with. I've never used it before, but I saw it sitting on the shelf at the garden centre and I thought, you know what? Maybe other people use this, maybe other people have experience with it, maybe they can share their experience in the comments, I don't know. I'm talking about these calcined clay balls. Now, this is a clay that has been high-fired, very, very high heat, and the end result is a product that is almost pumice-like in appearance. They're very, very light, and I can see just by looking at them, again, riddled with those tiny pores. And so, as a result, I suspect that these are going to do a fantastic job sitting somewhere in the space of Scoria and pumice when looking after our plants. If you've got any experience with this stuff, give us a shout. Let us know in the comments what you reckon. Sold as a hydroponic product largely, and I imagine not necessarily the cheapest thing, but if you can't get your hands on anything else, probably worth a try, I reckon. And now I've got 4 minerals for you that serve slightly different purposes. And the first of these is one that I would say sits on the top shelf right alongside pumice that can go into any mix you can possibly imagine. It's this stuff here. It's called zeolite. It's a fantastic horticultural mineral. Now, I don't want to get too technical, but one of the properties of this stuff, it holds onto and locks nutrients within the mineral itself, and then very, very gradually releases it over time. Now, what does that mean for our plants? It means that when we fertilize them, the nutrients that are released from our fertilizer don't just get washed straight through with, the next watering. They become available over a very long period of time. This stuff almost becomes kind of like the equivalent of a slow release fertilizer. Fantastic, brilliant mineral that has a very valuable role to play in ensuring the ongoing health of our plants. If I was making a mineral mix and I could only have 2 ingredients, I'd have pumice for sure. And then right there alongside it, I'd have zeolite. Probably about 10% ratio, I think it sits there at its maximum efficiency, but well worth experimenting with. Another mineral that I find is quite readily available is this stuff, vermiculite. Now, vermiculite has a bit of a role to play, you find, in seed rearing mixes. It's often sold as a propagation material. It's similar to perlite in that it is extremely light and insanely porous. But the thing about this is that it is extremely, extremely moisture retentive, which is what makes it so valuable for raising, let's say, vegetable seedlings as an example. What role does this stuff therefore have to play in growing our cacti and succulents? Now, ordinarily I would say this is something that should be avoided like the plague, because our plants don't need minerals that will just hang on to moisture at all costs. However, depending on the nature of your mix, depending on how chunky it is, how well draining it is, I do find that there is a role to play for vermiculite in the soils that I make up. Sydney is ridiculously hot and dry over the summertime, and my soil in here, it can dry out super, super quick. Now, if I don't want to be watering every day or every second day, putting about 10% by volume of vermiculite into my soil mix means that my plants have a consistent access to moisture and I don't have to water nearly quite so much. But it is a danger product. Use carefully and use sparingly, and it might add value or it might just kill your plants. So be very careful. And another note about vermiculite, it degrades over time. It's so porous that structurally I can easily crush it between my fingers and it will break down with time. And so it's one of those things that you are going to need to ensure that at least every couple of years repotting your soil to ensure it doesn't become compacted and horrible. But that's good practice anyway. Now, speaking of a mineral that degrades over time, here's another that has a very niche impact in our world of cactus and succulent growing. This stuff here is a Japanese product called Akadama. Now, Akadama is beloved of bonsai growers. It's fantastic for its drainage properties. Essentially what it is a hardened clay. And the most useful thing about this for us as cacti and succulent lovers is that it has an acidic pH value. That means that it will raise the acidity and therefore provide a fantastic base for any of our plants that do prefer a more acidic soil. What sort of plants are they? Well, what you'll find is that most cacti, especially those that come from South America, don't mind a bit of an acidic soil. Not those that come from Mexico and thereabouts. I'll get onto them in a moment. As well as plants like your pachypodiums. In fact, some pachypodiums, they will just thrive the more acid the soil is. And so, adding something like Akadama to the soil of an acid-loving plant can be a valuable thing, because when they've got the right acidity levels, it means that they can uptake nutrients at an appropriate and necessary level. And unsurprisingly, that makes them healthier and grow more strongly and end up being a more impressive specimen plant in our collections. And in fact, in a minute, that's actually going to be the basis for part of the experiment that I'm going to launch today. I've got this pot of insanely over potted Pachypodium gracilis seedlings, and they're going to be split up, put into two different mixes. One of them using Akadama as a basis to provide that acidity. The other one, not worrying too much about it. And we're going to monitor them over the course of 6 months and see if providing them with a more niche soil actually does them any good. But before we get there, I've got one more mineral component to talk to you about. And that mineral component is this stuff here, limestone, sitting at the other end of your pH scale, a more alkaline substance. Now, what you're going to find is that limestone is relatively common the world over, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a fantastic draining substance to put into our soils. It certainly does drain well, but by using this, you will raise the alkalinity of your soil mix. And most of the cacti and succulents that we grow don't necessarily appreciate that. As soils get more alkaline, you'll find, with some exceptions only, that plants find it harder to uptake nutrients. And so this is probably one of those things to avoid using unless you do have some of those plants. And it just so happens that I do have some of those plants that are going to be the other side of the experiment that we're going to be launching today. Let me just go get them. Here is our pot of Carpus horripilis, because what you'll find is that plants from Mexico, like these little miniatures, do come from a part of the world that is naturally very limestone heavy, and therefore the plants themselves have adapted to enjoy and grow quite happily in limestone soils. Now, I've read a lot of conjecture that plants from that part of the world, they tolerate the limestone in the soil. They don't necessarily thrive in it. And so what's going to be really interesting here, once again, I'm going to split these up and give some of them the limestone and others are going to go into a more basic soil mix. It'll be really interesting to monitor them over the growing season and see, does the limestone help them grow? Do they grow happier, stronger? Or is it just that they're tolerating it and it acts as a growth hindrance? I'm going to be really fascinated to find out what's going on. Now, that's all the different components for you. In a moment, we are going to start that experiment. I'll tell you the terms, I'll tell you the nature of the soils. But what I really recommend that you do, take the information around these minerals, and indeed, if you can source something different locally to you, check it out, experiment with it. The only way you can figure out what works best for you is to try things out. And that's precisely what we're about to do now as I muck around with soils and launch an experiment that should take us through the current Australian growing season. Now, the goal of our experiment today is to figure out if a needlessly complex, finely tuned soil mix is better for our plants than something cheap and cheerful. I suspect that the endless tinkering that I do might only give the most incremental of value to the plant's growth, but I'm going to be really fascinated to find out if that's actually the case. So what I've got is 3 different soil mixes. First of all, the cheap and cheerful mix. It's a 50-50 blend of cactus soil and perlite. Nothing else whatsoever. Very cheap, very accessible mix. Not necessarily the thing that I would normally use, but it's going to be fascinating to see how these plants grow in that. Now, for the Pachypodiums, our acid lovers, I have another blend here. This is also 50% cactus mix, but the mineral component, it's got pumice, it's got decomposed granite, it's got zeolite, and then it's got Akadama to give it that acidic punch. And hopefully, those Pachypodiums, which come from the granite fields of Madagascar with more acidic soils, will appreciate the thought that I've put into that mix. Now, on the other hand, our Carpus, coming from the calcareous limestone soils of Mexico, I've put together a blend, also 50% cactus mix, that organic component, but the mineral structure of this one, we've got pumice, we've got zeolite, and then we've got limestone. And that should, in theory, raise the pH value of the soil to better suit the growing conditions of our Carpus. So let's get them all potted up and then we'll talk about how this experiment is going to proceed from here. Now, in order to make the observations here valuable, I'm going to try and start off with plants of similar sizes going into each of the mixes. And so, I've divided the Terpenicarpus into 2 groups of 8. One half of this pot, one half of this tray will go into the cheap and cheerful perlite based mix, then the other will go into the limestone based mix, which seeks to mimic their habitat, at least in some respect. And then I've done a similar thing here with the Pachypodiums. It's not 100% scientific, but I've divided them up into plants of roughly equal sizes. And so here we're going to have 7 plants going into the Akadama mix and 7 going into the perlite cheap and cheerful. All right, anyway, time to get these all potted up and I'll be back in a sec. So these are now going to get the same amount of fertilizer, the same watering regime, be placed in the same spot so they're getting the same sort of sunlight, and hopefully that'll control all those other variables. So all we'll really be looking at is the impact of the soil. Now, in theory, the fancy, more expensive, more finely tuned soil should hold up better. But sometimes all that tinkering doesn't really amount to a whole lot. So it's going to be fascinating to come back and revisit the Terpenicarpus and the Pachypodiums in about 6 months' time, see if there's been any significant impact on growth. Now, really, the takeaway from all of this today, I'm hoping, is that you're going to walk away a little bit better armed with some knowledge about all the sorts of different mineral soils that are available to you, so that you can concoct your own thing, fully informed, and maybe you'll be able to put something together that works even better than what I have today. So that's it for another episode of Arid Zine. I hope you've enjoyed the show. I'm Michael. I'll catch you next Monday.